tonight on The New Reality.
Good morning, Ellen.
Back to school.
I think moving forward, learning might never be the same. I think it'll be better.
The future of meat processing.
What the plants look like pre-COVID are not what they look like currently, and I don't think that's what the plants will look like post-COVID.
Virus mysteries.
We know that there are people that don't have any symptoms related to COVID-19.
The many questions that remain.
How many people have actually been infected? We don't know that at all.
COVID and climate change, the twin crises.
We need this kind of reduction every year, and we don't want to have a pandemic to do that.
And the new reality of concerts.
Right now, this is the best that we can do to bring people together and bring live music back.
Hello, I'm Dawna Friesen. Here we are in the middle of June, and nothing is as it should be. Students who are graduating are quietly moving on. The traditional celebration's a thing of the past. And the last few months of education have been less than ideal. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the United Nations has monitored school closures around the world. At the peak, more than 91% of the world's students were out of class. That's close to 1.6 billion children. Some places have begun reopening schools. Just over 20 European countries, for example, have allowed kids back in class, but with restrictions, and there have been setbacks. In France, within days of reopening, there were outbreaks, and several schools had to close again after 70 students and staff tested positive for COVID-19. For those still open, it hasn't been business as usual by any means. There are smaller classes, cafeterias are closed, lockers are out of use, libraries off limits. Here in North America, most states and provinces have been cautious. There have been limited reopenings in a handful of American states. And in Canada, several provinces have welcomed students and teachers back, but it's not business as usual. In Quebec, one of the first jurisdictions on the continent to reopen classes, it wasn't province-wide. In the Montreal metropolitan area, the region hit hardest by COVID-19, schools are still closed. Where they are open, we wanted to see how things have gone. Our Mike Armstrong went to Howick Elementary, just an hour outside Montreal. Getting back into class has been a learning experience for everyone, and some of the lessons could be applied across Canada.
When parents pull up and drop their kids off, things at Howick Elementary School look normal. You notice what's not normal when the buses pull up. Basically, the numbers.
Good morning, Ellen.
Instead of 30 or 40 kids, this bus drops off 4. Classes are optional, and a lot of parents have decided to keep their kids home. For those who did come back, this last part of the year is sort of a dry run for the fall.
The kids that are here now are going to be better off in September than the ones that are just coming straight back. That's what I think. That's kind of what we thought about it.
Howick Elementary would normally have 170 students, kindergarten to grade 6. Right now, it has just 40 students.
So it is a challenge.
Rob Butters heads the New Frontiers School Board. He says attendance board-wide is running at about 29%.
There's been various reasons why parents have chosen to keep the children home. The first one is absolutely there's still the fear of catching the virus, no question about it.
Now, when the school reopened, there were a ton of changes. One of them limiting access. While students are in class, journalists aren't allowed in the building. They did let us in after school.
So it's a little strange.
But Principal Melanie Primo agreed to take one of our small cameras inside to show us how things are going.
Hold on, I'll even get the door for you.
Thank you, sir.
No, thank you.
I'll be back.
The first thing you notice is the physical distancing. The desks are far apart, and that's where kids spend most of their time. In fact, to cut down on possible transmission of COVID-19, a lot of the school is closed.
The lunchroom's not being used, the library's not being used. Our gymnasium is not really used as a gymnasium. Our outside play structures can't be used.
There are new markings on the floors of the hallways. Everyone's supposed to stay to the right and to keep 2 meters from the people in front of them, which leads to the question, can you even get kids to physically distance?
I'd say 95% of the time, yes, but we're human and sometimes we cross paths and we back up. I'd say the biggest challenge is outside. When they're playing, one of my phys ed teachers actually organizes games for them outside to sort of teach them how to play social distance style.
No, it's your recess.
The staff is adapting, and some of it's a little strange. The soccer balls that usually get cleaned once a year are now sanitized several times a day. And there's also a new activity. Students are bringing their personal bikes to school for gym class.
The bikes, it's just to have another activity, have them able to use some equipment, because it's hard to lend out equipment unless we're washing it every single time.
Some Quebec schools that reopened have had setbacks. In the first 3 weeks, close to 50 students tested positive and more than 30 staff. That despite all the preventative measures. The New Frontiers Board hasn't had a student test positive. They've been a little less lucky on the staff side.
I believe we've had 4 staff members who have been tested since we came back in May 11th, and I believe only one of them was positive, and that person is fine now. We've been fortunate as a school board to have not had a high number of cases that we've had to involve testing.
But you watch for that, I would imagine.
We certainly daily. I mean, that's one of the big roles of the principal and the staff here at the school. And we urge parents and children to not come to school if you're not feeling well.
When the province made the move to reopen schools, the argument was that while there was a danger, it was outweighed by the potential damage. Kids with learning difficulties need to be monitored, and for others sitting at home for months, mental health can be an issue. But the partial return with smaller classes has let schools find what works and what doesn't. The maximum number of students in a class was supposed to be 15. They found 11 is pretty much the maximum if you want to let kids stand up. The school also now has an indoor and an outdoor to help with social distancing, and they're working on new ways to send homework and notes home with students.
We don't even know if the kids are going to be able to bring things home. So we've decided as a staff to not buy agendas.
The big issue right now is communication inside the school, across the school board, and across the country. Quebec is being watched and sharing its experiences. Some experts predict this pandemic will lead to major changes in education, everything from the rethinking of the school calendar to new ways of teaching. The New Frontiers Board barely did any online instruction before this. Now it's something new it brings to the table going forward, and it's sticking around.
I think we'll be a better system with the ability to have blended learning. Time will tell. I think moving forward, learning might never be the same. I think it'll be better.
No matter what industry you work in, whether you've lost your job, are working from home, or have the kind of job where you can't stay home, every Canadian workplace has felt the effects of COVID-19. Among the hardest hit are meat processing plants, where outbreaks have infected hundreds of workers. It was so bad at some of the plants, they had to close. Meat processing is big business. About 65,000 people work in the industry in Canada. All the facilities now are back in operation with new safety measures in place, but the virus has sent a shudder through the industry. It is vulnerable, and so is our food supply. Is it time for a fundamental rethink of how it's structured? Heather Yourex-West is looking into that.
Me and my siblings keep saying that he was the best dad in the world because he truly was.
51-year-old Benito Quesada died from COVID-19 in hospital on May 7th, leaving behind a wife, 4 children, and an empty space that will never be filled.
We haven't touched anything of his. His boots are still there in the entryway. His toothbrush, his cologne, everything's still there.
Quesada worked at the Cargill meat packing plant in High River, Alberta. He took a $500 bonus to keep working after employees started to get sick. Soon, he was infected too, and for weeks he lay in a hospital ICU, fighting for his life.
He's always strong. He's the one that protects us, and seeing him there super vulnerable, I had never seen him like that.
Quesada was the second worker at the Cargill plant to die of COVID-19. 67-year-old Hip Bowie passed away in April. The plant closed on April 20th after Bowie's death. In all, at least 943 Cargill employees tested positive, and more than 1,500 cases were linked to the plant. It was the largest outbreak from a single site in Canada. Meanwhile, there were 661 workers infected at the JBS beef plant in Brooks, Alberta, and one of those workers died. These plants are a perfect place for a virus to spread. They are cold, and most of them are laid out like this JBS plant in the United States, workers standing elbow to elbow on the cutting line. Unlike Cargill, the JBS plant in Alberta was never shut down because of the outbreak, but it did scale down operations, cutting production to just one shift a day. It's now back to running 2 shifts of workers, but inside it is far from business as usual. That's because until there's a vaccine, both the company and its workers are very aware that another outbreak could happen at any time.
So they've introduced PPE so that people are wearing masks and visors. They've put plastic barriers between individual people working in the plant in order to reduce the flow of air between individuals. They've staggered people's start and finish times. They've staggered breaks to reduce the density. They've put dividers in buses and increased the number of buses.
So far, those measures seem to be working. As of this week, there were only 2 active cases among workers at Cargill and JBS, and no new outbreaks have been reported. But some workers still don't feel safe.
Actually, I have friends, they still stay in the house now. They said that, no, I don't want to go back because we're scared.
Remilyn B.I. tested positive for COVID-19 in late April, even though she had no symptoms. The single mom returned back to work at JBS last week. She says she feels safe, but she knows many of her co-workers have been reluctant to return. For an industry that was facing a labor shortage before this pandemic, that's a big problem.
It's one of the reasons we have often new immigrants working in these plants, because they're not jobs that everybody wants. So even before the risk of infection through COVID, which we've now reduced, these plants often had trouble filling jobs.
As meat processors inch back towards full production, balancing worker safety and profitability will become more difficult. But it also may not be possible to keep workers physically distant in existing factories. That could mean higher meat prices for Canadians in the short term. But in the long term, the Canadian Meat Council says there may be bigger changes coming.
What I said to a few people in government is what the plants look like pre-COVID are not what they look like currently, and I don't think that's what the plants will look like post-COVID. What I do think it has done is advance the discussion of whether or not you would want to look at having more automation in your plants, and I think on balance, most of the plants are looking at that at some level.
This might be a sneak peek at the future. At this pork plant in Denmark, machines do much of the cutting that humans do in North America.
Tyson's always been a company that's been out on the forefront of innovation.
Just last year, U.S. meat processing giant Tyson Foods opened this sparkling new facility in Arkansas to develop new technology, automating many of its production processes. And in 2015, JBS bought Scott Technologies, a New Zealand company that specializes in robot butchers.
We developed the world's first lamb X-ray primal and middle system.
This promotional video from here at the JBS lamb processing plant in Australia shows how the company uses sophisticated technology like artificial intelligence to automate some meat cutting jobs that humans used to do.
It does that by X-raying every animal as an individual animal and identifying where the 4th and 5th rib are and where that hindquarter cut is. And that's the whole purpose of that X-ray primal machine.
X-rays and CT scanners are used to create a 3D model of the shape and size of the carcass before the cutting starts. Scott Technologies claims this results in 90% accuracy. The machines are also faster, and over time, these robot butchers keep getting better at their job. And unlike humans, they don't get sick or injured, and they don't need breaks or benefits. The technology has already significantly reduced the number of workers on the cutting lines. Automation could make meat plants much safer when the next virus hits. It could also mean fewer jobs. But as the Quesada family tries to find small moments of joy without their husband and father, they're not thinking about that now.
My family is devastated, and this time is very hard every day. Every day is very hard.
They're just trying to come to terms with the loss.
With me from Fort Collins, Colorado, is Semple Grandin. She's a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. She's an author, inventor, lecturer, and designer of livestock handling facilities all over North America. Her thinking process is based more on visual images than words, and her autism gives her a unique ability to understand how animals see the world, and her skills have helped meat processors and slaughterhouses handle animals in a more humane way. And she's a female trailblazer in a mostly male industry. Semple Grandin, thanks for joining us. Given what you know about meat processing plants, how many people work there, how closely they work, the hundreds of workers who have become sick with COVID-19, what grade do you give the industry for how it's responded to the pandemic?
Well, they've actually worked hard to respond to it. COVID attacks where people are crammed together, whether it's cruise ships, prisons, aircraft carriers, any place where they're together. And actually, the plants seem to be recovering now. I just talked to 2 pork plants 2 days ago, and they tested everybody in the plant, and there were many positives, but the interesting thing is that half of those positives had no symptoms. So something's going on here with the virus. But the virus attacks people that are indoors, close together, no matter where it is.
Yeah, there's so many unanswered questions still about how this virus spreads and how it's transmitted. Meat processing, I know you know, has changed so much in the last few decades. You've been a part of that. It's also become so centralized in these big factories that process, I think, 2,000 to 6,000 cattle a day in some cases, as many as 20,000 pigs a day. Have they become too big to be resilient?
That's a problem, but the problem of big is fragile is not just meat. It's also the semiconductor industry. It's also the pharmaceutical industry. In semiconductors, we rely on 3 factories in the world for the heart of your computer, the heart of your phone, pharmaceuticals, raw materials coming from China and India, common generic drugs. Container ships are now infected. That's like 80% of all our trade. Big is fragile. Now, the thing about big is it's very efficient. Large meatpacking plant can do really good animal welfare. It can do really good food safety. But when it breaks, you've got real big problems in the supply chain. Big is fragile. It's very cost effective, very economical. A more distributed supply chain will not get disrupted, but it's going to cost more. I don't care if it's meat or whether it's semiconductors or whether it's pharmaceuticals.
Just looking specifically at the meat industry for a moment, though, what role do you think automation should or could play in the future to, I guess, eliminate some of the fragility, at least from a human perspective?
Well, some of the jobs are difficult to automate. Automation is easy when you have like a part that you're making that every one of them is exactly the same. Animals have got biological variability. Now, big is fragile for other reasons too. Storms, natural disasters, war, possibly, is another thing that makes big is fragile.
So what do you think, you're so good at analyzing systems, what do you think a possible solution is now? Is it sort of breaking down these huge, let's look at meat processing specifically, breaking down these huge processors into smaller players across the country the way it used to be?
Well, I think what's happening is is similar to the beer market. You know, right here in Fort Collins where I live, we got the great big Coors plant, but then you have all these little tiny craft breweries. And I think it's going to be more local things like this. Well, when I first went in the industry in Arizona, we had our 2 big ones. They were Cudahy and Swifts. And then we had a bunch of what I call medium-sized plants. So we had Arizona Beef, we had Hearst's. Arizona Beef might do 400 cattle a day. It was not a locker plant. But all the other smaller plants are maybe 1/3 of the beef supply. Now those little plants, the smaller plants they couldn't compete with the big guys. So what's happened in other industries like beer, for example, is you don't try to compete with the big guys. You do something that's special.
So if there are microbreweries now that are doing very well, you're suggesting micro meat processing?
Well, that's actually, some of this is starting to happen. In fact, I went to New Zealand 2 years ago, and they have rather small plants. They call them boutique plants, and they'll put out very specific orders, 100 boxes of some special cut to send to Japan, for example.
So if we want meat processing that is both humane as possible for the animals and safe as possible for the human workers, do you think we're going to have to prepare to pay more for meat?
Big concentrated supply chains are fragile. The paradox is big is very efficient. Big can do a really good job. Food safety, animal welfare, whatever, but it's fragile. And if you go to a more distributed supply chain, it's going to be less prone to disruption. I don't care what product it is, but it's going to cost more. That's the paradox. I don't care what product it is. Meat, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical supply chain, the really big example of big is fragile.
Just one more question about the industry. I know you're closely connected to the meat industry. Do you think they have a handle now on the spread of COVID-19, or do you think we might continue to see outbreaks in these processing plants?
I think the plants have got a handle on it now. We're going to get outbreaks. What's going to happen in the restaurants? Who knows? That's a bigger worry right now than the plants. I think that's gotten under control there. The weekly slaughter rates are going back up. That's a very good sign that they have a handle on it. I'm looking at my cattle buyers weekly, and they said that the capacity of the plants, they're ramping it up. That means they're getting it under control. Some of these plants got down to half capacity. You know, now the industry's running about 80, 90% now. That's actually good.
Still ahead.
We will make an incredible summer memory together.
DriveIn Concerts, the new reality with country music star Brett Kissel. Plus,
we all get up every morning, we get into our cars, we drive.
COVID and climate change.
Now we've learned, I think we can do these things a lot better.
The negative and positive impacts of the pandemic on the environment. And learning lessons.
This is not just a respiratory illness.
And burning questions.
Why have some populations been resistant and others have been explosive?
Breaking down the COVID mysteries that remain.
It feels like the whole world is in a war against an unconventional enemy. The novel coronavirus has disrupted modern society on a scale most people alive today have never witnessed. It's been about 4.5 months since the first case was confirmed in Canada, and we began to realize the insidious spread. There are now more than 7.5 million cases around the world, and it's known to have killed more than 420,000 people. The majority of those who get it survive and do recover. That is the good news. So is the fact the daily number of new cases in Canada almost everywhere is in decline. But as we begin to reopen the economy, the risk remains. There are still so many unknowns about how this virus is transmitted, how it attacks the body, and why some people die and others show no symptoms. We all want answers, but what we've got right now are lots of questions. Tonight, we explore some of the big ones.
We'll keep living in this new reality with the threat of the virus lurking as long as it keeps outsmarting us. It's still moving faster than our best scientists, leaving us chasing many unknowns. Even one of America's most experienced infectious disease experts, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has studied HIV and Ebola, says the novel coronavirus is his worst nightmare.
Like, oh my goodness, when is it going to end? It really is very complicated. So we're just at almost the beginning.
Among the biggest questions is who? Who has it?
How many people have actually been infected? We don't know that at all.
The mystery of the asymptomatic, the so-called silent spreaders, is confounding. People infected with the virus who never show any symptoms and could be fueling the pandemic without knowing it.
One of the reasons why COVID has been such a successful virus, it's able to fill people's lungs and have them expel that and spread it without feeling sick. In that sense, it's one of the most frightening viruses that I could think of.
Frightening and the subject of intense debate. On Monday, a top doctor at the World Health Organization seemed to dismiss asymptomatic spread.
It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward.
By Tuesday, after pushback from many epidemiologists, she clarified what she meant.
What we need to better understand is how many of the people in the population don't have symptoms, and separately, how many of those individuals go on to transmit to others.
It's perplexing and needs much more research, but some initial studies show between 25 to 45% of infected people have no symptoms.
Ticket R 004.
Doctors in Canada are noticing it.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nimji.
Tasleem Nimji is an emergency room physician at Humber River Hospital in Toronto.
So first of all, have you had any fevers?
Fever,
No fever, chills.
Every patient who arrives here is screened for COVID-19 symptoms.
So whenever we see a patient, we're thinking about the different potential diagnoses. Now, COVID-19 is a part of almost every one of those lists of possibilities that you're thinking about in your head when you're trying to help a patient, because it presents in different ways, and because we know that there are people that don't have any symptoms related to COVID-19, at least not on our typical list of symptoms, that will still test positive.
Patients who come in for other reasons with no apparent COVID symptoms are testing positive.
It's a virus that's unpredictable. Some patients have no symptoms, and we've seen that. Like, we've been surprised with some patients that came in with a hip fracture and have no symptoms of COVID at all, but are positive.
It's still believed people who are most infectious are those with serious respiratory symptoms, but the possibility of silent, invisible spread persists and will only be revealed through widespread, repeated testing.
If you just rely on testing people who come forward with symptoms, you're going to miss a very large number of people with the disease, and they're the ones driving community spread. A huge chunk of this is getting a hold of people who are transmitting before they know they're transmitting.
In what ways is COVID-19 attacking the body and confounding doctors? In the ICU, Dr. Jamie Spiegelman has seen firsthand the myriad of ways COVID-19 can bombard the human body.
This is not just a respiratory illness. It starts as a respiratory illness. We've seen heart failure from it. We've seen kidney failure from it. It affects every organ, so it's clearly a systemic disease.
Studies in the US and the UK suggest more than a third of COVID-19 patients who end up in ICU experience kidney failure.
What we've noticed in our ICU is patients that go on dialysis who get renal failure from this have way worse outcomes. Most of those patients, from our experience, die.
It's as dramatic a range as that. Some get only mildly ill, others die. It's a mystery why in some people the virus drives the immune system into overdrive. The body starts to attack its own cells.
So we know that most of the sickness of the things that kill you or make you very, very sick is actually your body responding. So your immune response to this assault on your system is the thing that makes you go to the hospital, the cytokine storm, we call it.
And for those who make it through, there could be lasting harm.
But we have been discovering that when COVID is able to really get into you systemically, it causes damage in the heart, it causes damage in the liver, it causes damage in the kidneys.
It's why testing people already dealing with other diseases is vitally important.
And this is also why you're seeing now more rigorous testing in populations, certainly in the populations of people that have kidney disease that are dialysis patients.
Where is the virus headed? How is it mutating?
We don't know its mutation rate, really, and in fact, if it's mutating in one direction or another.
All viruses mutate. The mystery is, what's the novel coronavirus doing? How fast is it changing? And could it become more dangerous or less?
It mutates less frequently than the influenza virus. On average, I've seen estimates of 1 to 2 mutations per month. And these mutations are important to track.
Early signs are tending to the positive.
The good news is we haven't seen any mutations so far that make it seem to suggest that the virus is becoming more lethal.
In this respect, the forces of evolution might lean in our favor.
The nature of mutation is that selective pressures put upon it by the environment determine which mutations thrive. So there is a theory, these pathogens mutate towards lesser lethality.
When can we assume we are immune to it? Or can we? In the absence of a vaccine, immunity is emerging as a potential key to resuming normal life. It's hoped those who have had COVID-19 are now immune to it, but that's all it is, hope. there is no evidence.
I'd really love to hear more about the immunology behind this and how effective are immune responses in people who've been infected? How durable are they? So how long do they last?
Why? Why are some people hit hard by it and others barely get sick?
Some people do well and recover and not get that sick, whereas other people might get very, very sick with this infection, who otherwise are of the same age.
Men seem more vulnerable. Children seem less so, though some are developing a mysterious multi-system inflammatory syndrome. We've seen centenarians survive and healthy young adults succumb.
Why are these people not symptomatic and why other people are so symptomatic that they end up on life support machines in the ICU? So we don't completely understand that as well. It's not like the virus is any different, so there must be some genetic predisposition.
Scientists are searching for genetic signs that might help explain the extreme variations in vulnerability. One study zeroed in on regions of the human genome that could be associated with a higher risk of respiratory failure. The same study found a 50% increase in patients with type A blood were in need of oxygen or a ventilator.
I've heard one person call this the dark matter of immunity. Why have some populations been resistant and others have been explosive? It's not just about the age demographic. And this might be a good thing. It might mean that we reach herd immunity sooner. It might mean that the ceiling for explosiveness of this disease is lower than we thought. But again, it's a mystery.
How? How will this end? Or are we going to be living with the novel coronavirus for a long time? No one alive today has lived through a pandemic like this. We're not used to such uncertainty, unable to plan for the next month, the next year. We will adapt, and we will keep learning.
I don't expect to be afraid of this disease by this time next year. That won't be because of a vaccine. It'll just be because we will know better how to treat it, and people need not die of it at the same rate that they're dying now.
Maybe it will turn out better than we feared, but we need to confront the possibility some things may turn out worse than we hoped. This Chicago woman in her 20s recovered from COVID-19, but it devastated her lungs, and she underwent a double lung transplant. Which raises another lingering question.
Is what happens when you're infected and you get serious disease and you recover? What are the long-term, durable negative effects of that infection? We don't have enough experience because we've only been involved in 4 months.
Coming up,
we need this kind of reduction every year.
The twin crises.
We could probably see a 40-50% reduction in the number of smoggy days.
How much the COVID-19 pandemic is really moving the needle on climate change. The upside to the pandemic is in the air. It's cleaner, there's less pollution because we're flying less, driving less, and industry has slowed to almost a halt. Greenhouse gas emissions plunged in April by about 17% overall. In some countries, the drop was more like 40%. That is great news, and it feels like nature is rebalancing a bit. Though as Jeff Semple explains, it's just a blip in the big picture of climate change.
Paul Koch woke up one morning last month to find a trespasser taking a dip.
So I called my wife and said, "There's a moose in the pool."
The 800-pounder made quite a splash for several hours before making her own way out of the backyard. Koch and his wife have lived in this suburban Ottawa neighborhood for 40 years, but this was a first.
We've had lots of pool parties over the years, but not one with a moose or any animal.
With humans living in lockdown, the animal kingdom is reclaiming some territory. In Thailand, these monkeys are going ape, embroiled in a street fight over food in the center of town.
I don't know.
Wild turkeys are strolling the suburbs of Louisiana. Even penguins have been spotted jaywalking in South Africa. The list of unusual wildlife sightings goes on and on and on. This cartoon pretty much sums up the sentiment.
Even here on the campus of the University of Toronto Scarborough, when I bike in, I routinely see deer now in campus. The major inhibitor of the movement of animals across the city is traffic, will be busy roads. And now we've seen major roads, major arteries in the city being almost devoid of cars.
This spring, traffic volumes in Toronto were cut in half, and those silent streets are also providing a breath of fresh air. Smoggy skylines from some of the world's most polluted places are clearing. The contrast is even starker from space, revealing nitrogen dioxide emissions in China and Italy before and after the lockdown. In India, particle pollution fell by nearly 60%.
We are seeing improvements here in North America as well.
During the pandemic's peak, Canada's largest cities saw air pollution levels, highlighted here in blue, drop by 15%.
I would suspect that we could probably see a 40–50% reduction in the number of smoggy days.
Pollution kills 7 million people every year, according to the World Health Organization. And some experts expect that this cleaner air might actually save more lives this year than are lost to the virus. And that plummeting pollution is also sparking a debate over whether the pandemic might be flattening the climate curve. 2020 is witnessing a carbon crash. CO2 emissions, which fuel climate change, are taking a nosedive, unlike anything we've seen before.
The reduction in terms of tons of CO2, which is what really matters for the atmosphere, we're definitely going to have by far the biggest reduction ever.
The good news, even as economies reopen, carbon emissions are expected to end the year down around 8%, the equivalent of India's entire energy use. Which brings us to the bad news.
Even if we get an 8% reduction this year, that's the sort of magnitude of reduction we would need this year, next year, the year after, and every single year in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees.
To meet the Paris summit goal and prevent the worst of climate change, global emissions need to fall by 7.6% every year for a decade. Even this unprecedented lockdown amounts to little more than a first step.
Basically, we need this kind of reduction every year. And we don't want to have a pandemic to do that. We don't want to have an economic recession to do that. And so we're going to need to make relatively large changes.
And some believe this moment represents our best chance for that change, a golden opportunity to go green.
We all get up every morning, we get into our cars, we drive, we go to meetings all over the world and everywhere all the time. And now we've learned, I think we can do these things a lot better.
Jatin Nathwani's office offers a glimpse into a sustainable future. A zero-carbon building, one of Canada's first, with a solar-paneled roof and geothermal heating. The University of Waterloo professor believes this economic crisis offers a chance to invest in these technologies. He points to the last time carbon emissions dropped, following the global recession in 2009. Governments then responded by pumping billions into stimulus projects, construction designed to boost the economy. But that also saw a sharp spike in emissions.
There wasn't anything green about it because there's typically not much green about, expanding a road or building a bridge or putting a new roof on the community rink.
But this time round, many countries are eyeing a so-called green recovery. The European Union is making climate change the centerpiece of its trillion-dollar investment, a stimulus package steering away from fossil fuels and towards energy-efficient projects. France is offering financial aid to beleaguered airlines, but only in exchange for investments in lower-emission aircraft. Even China, the world's largest emitter, has endorsed big spending on a slew of low-carbon infrastructure, albeit while still building new coal plants.
I believe that this is going to be different and will be different, partly because the recognition, the notion that we are really facing a very severe climate change question is no longer a matter of debate.
The United States may prove the exception as the White House steadily slashes green protections. But what about Canada? So far, the federal government has pledged $1.7 billion to clean up orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, salvaging thousands of jobs.
If we can put some of the people who were displaced out of the oil patch back to work into the cleanup process, then that actually is helping in that labor market.
Canada's oil sector was already reeling before the pandemic pushed gas prices down another 20%. Analysts predict demand for oil may take years to fully recover.
I think we're seeing a transformation here that is quite fundamental, that decouples our dependence on oil and fossil fuels.
He argues this pandemic presents an opportunity to fast-track the transition to renewable energy.
We should aim for an orderly phase-out, an orderly transition to efficiency electric vehicles, rather than trying to prop up and maintain an industry that has no long-term future. The government is being offered an opportunity on a golden platter, but I'm not too confident that they will take that opportunity.
Political will to push drastic change can be hard to come by in normal times, but this is anything but. The pandemic has seen millions heed the advice of experts to protect against an invisible threat.
The Canadian public has listened. We've stayed home. We physically distance. We are listening to medical experts and their advice to keep us safe. Now we need to do the same thing when it comes to climate change.
To protect the future not only for ourselves, but also our furry friends.
Next on The New Reality, setting the stage.
I'm not sure if this is the way of the future. It's kind of the way of the present.
The new reality of concerts for performers and fans.
There's so much information surrounding coronavirus out there now. We know you have questions. Email your questions at globalnews.ca. Tune in to Global National or go to globalnews.ca/coronavirus now to find the answers.
Remember the good old days when you could go to a concert and you could thrive off all that energy in the crowd? Well, bands want it back, and they're looking for ways to perform on stage in front of a live audience. Canadian country music star Brett Kissel seems to have cracked it. He's come up with a kind of throwback solution, drive-in concerts. Kind of like drive-in theaters. You pull up, stay in your vehicle, and listen to the band. Brett Kissel talked to me from the stage in Edmonton on Friday. Brett, so good to talk to you. I love the slogan on your website, tough times don't last, tough people do. Give us the basics of how these drive-in concerts of yours are going to work.
Well, I really appreciate that. Tough times don't last, tough people do is a motto that I live by. It's one of my songs. We actually just re-released it for the weekend, and I'm really excited that we get to play that show for our concerts. Our show here that we're doing, and all 8 of them, are very unique because there's no speakers hung up on the stage. As you can see, what it is that people are going to hear our show through their radio dial. So we perform into our soundboard, a soundboard into an FM transmitter into everybody's car stereos. We're just asking that everybody honk their horns when they like the song that they hear.
Oh, nice. So honking instead of clapping, I guess. And the idea is nobody gets out of their vehicles, right?
That's right. I mean, safety is a huge concern for us. We have to make sure that everybody's going to be safe, but also have a great time. So we've got all of these rules on our website, drivein.brettkissel.com, where we say some of these, I guess, scary rules, but we put a little country spin on them. So one of the big things was no washrooms, so please go before the show. And also no tailgating. We know everybody wants to, but stay in your vehicle so we can entertain you through the radio dial.
And what kind of response have you been getting? How are ticket sales?
It's been amazing. For us to have been able to sell out 8 shows in under an hour when we put tickets on sale a couple of weeks ago was something that really shattered my expectations. But one of the really cool things is that both of the shows that we are doing to, obviously to start our weekend has been this. It's for the frontline workers, first responders, healthcare heroes. So those first 2 shows have been free, but the other ones are obviously for the general public. What's really cool is that thanks to our partnership with Safeway Canada, 100% of our proceeds go straight to the food banks here in Alberta. That way we can do a lot of good and raise a lot of money for a cause and an organization that really needs it.
Well, for sure. Just give us quickly, Brett, a sense of how your community, your province has been coping with the pandemic. What are some of the stories you've heard from people?
Well, Canadians in general are very tough. Here in my province of Alberta, we've definitely been hit by tough times, but I know we're all trying to look for the silver lining in this, and that's why I wanted to do this concert, to raise spirit for Albertans, as well as do it as we've now announced that we've got 3 sold-out shows in Regina, Saskatchewan next weekend, so maybe this thing might snowball into a few more shows in a few more places.
Do you think this might be the way of the future, Brett, that others will start copying you?
You know what? I'm not sure if this is the way of the future. It's kind of the way of the present. Right now, this is the best that we can do to bring people together and bring live music back. But as far as I'm concerned, I hope we get back to regular scheduled programming and we get an opportunity to play the real shows the real way that we want, hopefully very soon.
We'll be right back on The New Reality.
That's our program for this week. Here are some of the stories we're working on at The New Reality. How will the pandemic change offices and how we work? Many of us have been working from home. Could that become permanent? And if we do go back to work, how are shared workspaces going to have to adapt to be safe workplaces? Plus, we've told you about how pro sports are slowly returning to action, but what about our younger athletes? We look at the new reality of organized sports and how our kids can play safely in a distanced world. And a reminder, you can find more stories about the new reality on our website, globalnews.ca/thenewreality. I'm Dawna Friesen. Thanks for watching.